Mara had never been the kind of woman who made grand decisions. The choices that shaped her life had always arrived quietly, dressed as small things: a turn taken on a familiar road, a word left unsaid, a piece of food set down on a rock and walked away from. She was 53 years old, lived alone in a stone cottage at the foot of the HFY Mountains, and had been gathering iron moss from the upper ridge slopes every week for the better part of 2 decades. The work was solitary and the pay was modest. Herbalists in the valley paid well enough for dried iron moss, and the climbing kept her strong. It was a good life, an uncomplicated one. She preferred it that way. The HFY Mountains had a reputation that kept most of Dusk Hollow's residents from venturing too far up the ridge paths. Not because of the terrain, which was manageable enough for anyone with good boots and patience, but because of what lived in the cave networks carved into the upper rock. Dragons. Not the grand storybook kind that terrorized cities. The HFY flight was old and generally indifferent to the village below. But indifferent was not the same as safe, and the elders of Dusk Hollow had spent generations teaching their children the value of that distinction. Mara had respected that boundary her entire adult life. She gathered her iron moss from the lower flats and did not linger. On her 3rd trip of that particular autumn, she took a higher path than usual to avoid a washed-out section of trail, and that was how she saw them. 7 small shapes clustered at the mouths of the mid-ridge tunnels, half in shadow, to scales still bright with the particular iridescence of the young. They were not threatening. They were not posturing. They were simply sitting in the way that hungry children sit, hunched slightly inward, eyes fixed on the middle distance, waiting for something they could not name to arrive and fix the hollow feeling. Mara stopped walking. She looked at them Mara was not a woman who lied to herself as a general rule. She had lived alone long enough to know that self-deception was a luxury that tended to compound interest. The longer you let it sit, the more it cost you when the reckoning finally arrived. She valued honesty in herself, the same way she valued good boots and a sharp knife. Practical things. Things that kept you upright on difficult terrain. Which made it somewhat remarkable how convincingly she lied to herself for exactly 6 days following that first afternoon on the ridge. It had been a one-time thing. Obviously, she had surplus food, a washed-out trail, an unusual path, and an unfortunate tendency to notice hungry things and respond to them without adequate forethought. None of that constituted a pattern, and none of that meant anything beyond the simple arithmetic of too much ham and not enough dinner companions. She was a practical woman making a practical decision about food she could not have carried home in good conscience anyway. She believed this completely and without reservation. She believed it while she smoked the 2 hams she'd bought at the Dusk Hollow market on Monday. She believed it while she wrapped them carefully in waxed cloth on Wednesday evening. She believed it while she packed her gathering sack on Friday morning, placing the iron moss pouches around the hams with the practiced efficiency of someone who had definitely not been unconsciously reorganizing this exact arrangement in her head since Tuesday. She started up the mountain path and her pack was heavier than it had been in years. She knew before she reached the first switchback why that was. She knew with the quiet certainty of someone whose hands had made a decision several days before her reasoning had caught up to ratify it. The knowing sat in her chest without judgment, patient and plain, waiting for her to simply acknowledge it and move forward. She did not acknowledge it. She kept walking. At the flat row. The 2nd month arrived the way 2nd months do, quietly, without announcement, distinguishable from the first only in the ways that things had already begun to change without your permission. There were 7 of them now at the flat rock. She did not know where the additional 3 had come from, whether they had always been in the tunnels and simply grown bolder, or whether word had spread in whatever way young dragons spread word among themselves. It did not particularly matter. They were there, and they were waiting, and the flat rock had begun to feel less like a point on a trail and more like a destination. They were extraordinary up close in a way that distance had not prepared her for. Their scales caught the afternoon light the way wet gemstones did. Not flashy, not performative, thus but with the deep, saturated richness of color that only appeared when light found the right surface at the right angle. Amber and green and deep blue and black, each one distinct, each one shifting subtly as they moved. Mara had spent 20 years on this mountain and considered herself a person of practical sensibilities and modest aesthetic feeling. And still she found herself pausing each week for just a moment longer than necessary, watching the light move across them before she set her sack down and got on with things. She learned their individual shapes the way you learned faces without consciously deciding to, through repetition and attention, and the particular human instinct for pattern that operated quietly beneath deliberate thought. The notched ear frill on the largest one, the matching blue frills on the bickering pair, and the small black one who positioned himself consistently at the back of the group and moved forward only after the others had finished, carrying himself with a restraint that seemed chosen rather than imposed. She catalogued them, filed them, assigned them no names whatsoever. She gave them names within 4 days, and was annoyed at every creature had a personality. Mara had known this about animals her whole life: the mill cat who was generous with strangers but bit her own kittens, the old draft horse at the Dusk Hollow stable who sulked for 3 days if you forgot to greet him before hitching him up. Personality was not something that required size or language or a certain number of years on the earth. It simply required a self. And the 7 young dragons of the HFY Ridge, it turned out, had selves in considerable abundance. Notch announced herself immediately and continuously. She was the largest of the 7, amber-scaled and broad across the shoulders in a way that suggested she would be formidable someday, and already knew it. The notch in her left ear frill had come from somewhere. A disagreement, a mishap. A piece of mischief gone slightly wrong, and rather than diminishing her, it seemed to complete her, the way a scar sometimes suits a face better than unmarked skin ever could. Notch always moved to the flat rock first, ate with the focused efficiency of someone who considered food a serious matter, and then sat back and watched Mara with those enormous copper eyes that held something layered and unreadable inside them. Not suspicion exactly, not gratitude exactly, something that existed in the space between those two things, still deciding what it wanted to become. Spit and Ember were impossible to be solemn about. The blue-frilled siblings were matched so closely in size and coloring that Mara could only tell them apart because Spit had a habit of tilting her head left when thinking, and Ember tilted right. And everything between them was a competition conducted at full intensity. Who reached the rock first? Who got the larger portion, who finished eating before the other, who could shoulder the other aside most effectively while making it look accidental. They bickered with the cheerful relentlessness of 2 creatures who genuinely enjoyed each other and had simply... The first snow came on a Tuesday night without much warning. Mara woke Wednesday morning to a world that had been replaced overnight with a quieter, heavier version of itself. 3 feet of snow had buried the cottage garden to the windowsills, packed the eaves into solid white shelves, and transformed the mountain path she climbed every week into something that no longer resembled a path at all. The HFY Ridge was invisible behind a moving curtain of white. The sky and the mountain had become the same thing, seamless and indifferent, and the cold that came through the cottage walls had the particular quality of cold that intended to stay. Mara stood at her window with her morning tea and looked up at where the ridge should have been and felt something she did not immediately have a word for. It was not quite fear, and it was not quite guilt. It sat lower than either of those things, in the part of the chest that registered not dramatic emergencies, but quiet, ongoing concerns, the kind of worry that did not spike and subside but simply settled in and kept a steady pressure, like a stone placed carefully on top of something you did not want to blow away. 7 shapes, 7 sets of scales still too young and new to have built up the full insulating thickness of adult dragons. 7 creatures who depended, more than they had before she started this, on a weekly delivery that was not coming this week and might not come for several weeks more. She was not foolish enough to climb a mountain in a blizzard. She knew the ridge paths in good weather, and she knew what they became in 3 feet of snow. And she had enough respect for her own continued survival to understand that dying on a mountain path helped no one, least of all 7 young dragons who could not know why she had stopped coming. She did not go. She made the sensible decision firmly and without extended deliberation, and she stood by it completely. And then she sat by her fire for the rest of D. Spring arrived the way it always did in the HFY foothills. Gradually, then suddenly, the snow retreating in stages up the mountain, until one morning the lower paths were clear and the air carried the particular sharpness of cold ground releasing itself back into warmth. Mara had her pack ready before the thaw was technically complete. She told herself she was simply being efficient. She had iron moss to gather, and the season did not wait for perfect conditions. She started up the path earlier than usual and climbed faster than she needed to. The mountain looked the same and different in the way that things always looked after an absence. The familiar shapes all present and accounted for, but carrying the slight strangeness of things that had continued existing without you there to observe them. New rockfall on the second switchback. But a dead pine brought down by the weight of snow, its roots pointing skyward with a kind of bewildered dignity. The iron moss flats, richer than she had ever seen them, fed by months of snowmelt. She registered all of it distantly. She was already looking up toward the flat rock. They were there, all 7 present and whole, and the relief that moved through her was so immediate and physical that she stopped walking for a moment just to let it pass. They were larger. Not dramatically, winter was not a growing season, but noticeably in the way that children were always slightly unrecognizable after a long absence. Their scales had deepened, the colors settling into themselves with more conviction, less of the bright newness that marked the very young. Notch carried herself with a gravity she had been building toward all autumn. But spit and ember had grown into their frills. Even their postures had changed in some subtle architectural way, as though their bones had made decisions over the winter about the creatures they intended to become. Mara was still taking all of this in when Shadow moved. He did not wait. He did not. The HFY adults were not careless parents. This was perhaps the most fundamental misunderstanding that the village of Dusk Hollow had carried about the flight for the 4 generations it had existed in the valley below. The dragons were assumed to be indifferent, great ancient creatures who deposited their young in the mid-ridge tunnels and disappeared into the high caves and the far hunting ranges without particular concern for what happened in their absence. This assumption had been useful to Dusk Hollow. It made the mountain feel more manageable, more navigable, more like terrain than like territory belonging to something that was paying attention. The assumption was wrong in every particular. Dragon parents watched their young the way the best farmers watch their soil, not constantly, not intrusively, but with the deep and practiced attentiveness of creatures who understood that the most important information was often the quietest, and that quiet information required cultivation to receive. They could read their children's scales the way experienced hands read earth, health and stress and contentment and hunger, all written in the subtle gradations of color and sheen that casual observation would never detect. A slight dulling at the edges meant insufficient protein. A particular richness in the base color meant sustained warmth and adequate rest. The specific brightness that appeared around the frills of well-fed young dragons was as readable to their parents as a field of deep-rooted crops was to a farmer who had worked the same land for decades. What the HFY adults had been reading in their children's scales all autumn and into the winter and through the spring was unambiguous. The young ones were thriving. not simply surviving on the ridge's natural resources, which were adequate but not generous in the way the scales were currently reporting. Thriving in a way that required explanation, and the explanation was not available in the Shiaha. Vareth had been alive for 411 years. She did not think of this as a remarkable number. Time, at a certain depth, stopped feeling like accumulation and started feeling like landscape. Something you moved through rather than collected. Something that shaped you the way weather shaped stone, gradually, and without asking permission. She had outlived 7 human generations in the valley below. She had watched Dusk Hollow built from 3 farmhouses and a mill into the modest permanence it currently occupied. She had seen kingdoms rise in the distant south and collapse back into the earth they had been so certain of owning. What 4 centuries gave you, more than anything else, was pattern recognition. Humans, in Varath's long experience, were not complicated in their wanting. They wanted safety, resources, power, or leverage, and every interaction they initiated with the Ashfin flight could be traced back to one of those 4 routes without much excavation required. The farmers who left offerings at the ridge boundary wanted the flight to ignore their fields. The hunters who ventured too high wanted trophies or pelts, or the particular status that came from proximity to danger survived. The officials who occasionally arrived from distant cities wanted treaties that cost the dragons something and cost the humans nothing. Even the ones who seemed motivated by curiosity were usually motivated by something that curiosity was a polite name for. Vareth had found the want in all of them. It had never taken long. She had been watching the Iron Moss woman since the first ham. She had expected to find the want quickly. A week, perhaps 2. And something would reveal itself. A lingering look toward the upper caves, where the adults slept on their accumulated centuries of gold and salvage. An attempt to follow the young ones back to the tunnel entrances. A pattern of increasing boldness that preceded some request or some trap. There was always something. Dragons did not make decisions the way humans made decisions. Humans, in Varath's observation, made decisions the way they did most things. Quickly, emotionally, with considerable confidence and insufficient information, and then spent the aftermath either defending the decision or quietly revising it while pretending they had not. There was an efficiency to this approach that Varath could acknowledge without admiring. It moved things forward. It simply moved them forward in directions that were frequently regrettable. The Ashfin flight took the better part of a season. They met in the high cave where the updrafts kept the air moving and the acoustics allowed for the low resonant tones that serious conversation required. There were 19 of them in the flight, ranging from Vareth's 4 centuries down to a young male named Thresh, who was barely 60 and still had opinions that outpaced his judgment by a considerable margin. Everyone spoke. Everyone was heard. This was not efficiency. It was something the flight valued more than efficiency, which was the particular quality of decision that came from having examined a thing from every available angle before committing to it. The arguments against were reasonable and well articulated. Humans who entered into relationships with dragons, even inadvertently, even innocently, created complications. The young ones were already attached, which was visible in their scales and their behavior, and the way Shadow had pressed his head against the woman's hand in early spring without any prompting. Attachment created vulnerability. Vulnerability in the young was the flight's collective responsibility. The woman was mortal and would die within a human lifetime, and what that loss would mean for 7 dragons who had grown up eating her food and knowing her footstep on the path was not a small question. Thresh said they should simply drive her off, gently but clearly, before the attachment deepened further. There. The gesture took a long time. That was the first thing Mara noticed, not the scale of it, not the proximity of 4 centuries of living creature descending toward her eye level, but the slowness. Varath lowered her great head with the deliberate, unhurried precision of something that had never once in its existence been required to rush, and had no intention of starting now. Each degree of descent was controlled and intentional. This was not the movement of a creature losing balance or making a casual adjustment. This was ceremony, measured and exact. And even without any framework for understanding what she was witnessing, Mara felt the weight of its formality the way you felt the formality of certain silences, in the chest, below the level of reasoning. She stood still. She kept her hands at her sides. She breathed. Varath's head came level with her own and stopped. The eye that regarded her at close range was the color of molten copper cooling at the edges, enormous and ancient, and layered with a quality of attention that made Mara feel, in a way that was not frightening, but was profoundly humbling, that she was being read. Not judged. Judgment implied a verdict being reached from a position of authority over the judged. This was different. This was the careful and thorough attention of an equal trying to understand another equal fully before proceeding. Then Varath sniffed her. Once, slowly, from the top of her head to her hands, the exhaled breath warm enough to stir her hair and carry the mineral richness of deep stone and wood smoke and something older beneath both. Then Mara stood completely still through this, and kept her breathing even and did not flinch, which cost her something, and she suspected Varath noted the cost, and noted also that she had paid it without complaint. Varath straightened, stepped back with the same deliberate slowness, and then she did nothing, simply remained present and still and watching, which was itself a kind of pee. 3 years was not a long time by any measurement that mattered on the Ashfin Ridge. For Varath, it was a breath, a pause between thoughts, a negligible interval in a life measured in centuries. For the 7 young dragons, it was a season of growth, scales deepening, bodies expanding into the shapes they would carry for the next 100 years, the first tentative experiments with flame that filled the upper tunnels with the smell of scorched stone and adolescent pride. For the mountain itself, it was nothing at all, the indifferent accumulation of weather and erosion and the slow, patient work of geology that had been proceeding since before anything living had thought to name the ridge the Ashfin. For Dusk Hollow, it was enough time to forget, in the comfortable way that small settlements forgot inconvenient things, that the mountain above them was occupied by anything other than scenery. The Thornwood Company arrived on a Wednesday in late summer with 3 wagons, a team of surveyors carrying equipment that caught the light in expensive ways, and a legal representative named Osler who wore boots that had never encountered a mountain path, and smiled with the practiced warmth of a man whose entire professional value resided in his ability to make bad news feel like a reasonable outcome. They set up in the Dusk Hollow Inn and spread their documents across the common room tables and explained, with the patient thoroughness of people who had done this many times in many villages, what was going to happen. The Thornwood Company held mineral rights to the Ashfen Ridge. These rights had been granted by a land office in a city 3 weeks' travel south, administered by officials who had processed the paperwork without consulting a map of any meaningful resolution and who had certainly never stood at the foot of the ridge and looked up at it. The rights were legal. The documents were real. The stamps and seals were from authorities that Dusk Hollow had no stand. Friday came and Mara climbed. The path was familiar enough now that her feet knew it without instruction. Every root crossing, every loose stone, every place where the trail narrowed and required a slight turn of the shoulder to pass cleanly. 3 years of weekly climbing had written the mountain into her body the way repeated work wrote itself into muscle and bone, below the level of conscious navigation. She could have climbed it in darkness. Some mornings in the deep winter she nearly had. The 7 were waiting at the flat rock, same as always. They were not small anymore. That was still a thing that caught her occasionally, yet the way the growth of familiar creatures caught you, not in the continuous daily observation, but in the sudden comparative moments when you measured present against remembered and found the distance larger than expected. Notch's head, when she chose to rest it somewhere, now required significant structural commitment from whatever was underneath. She had developed this habit over the past several months, the resting of her head, and she had decided that Mara's lap was the appropriate location for this activity, regardless of what Mara happened to be doing at the time. Mara sat on her usual flat stone, and Notch arranged herself with the elaborate casualness of a creature pretending the whole thing was spontaneous and lowered her head into Mara's lap, and 800 pounds of amber-scaled dragon settled there with a weight that was simultaneously absurd and, after sufficient repetition, simply ordinary. Mara scratched behind the good ear frill and looked out over the valley and told them about the Thornwood Company. She spoke in the low, even voice she used for these conversations, not quite the voice she used for other people, slightly slower, slightly more deliberate, shaped by 3 years of talking to listeners who understood tone and cadence and intention without necessarily parsing every word. She told them about the surveyors left Dusk Hollow at first light on Tuesday with their equipment and their clipboards and the particular confidence of men whose work had never previously given them reason to doubt that mountains would cooperate with being measured. There were 4 of them. Professional men, competent at their trade, experienced in the specific art of assessing terrain for extractive value. They had surveyed quarry sites across the southern ranges without incident. They knew mountain work. They wore appropriate boots, which already put them ahead of Osler, and they carried between them several decades of combined experience that had never once required them to revise their understanding of what a mountain could do. They were back in Dusk Hollow by mid-afternoon. And the return journey had clearly been conducted at a different pace than the outward one. Their equipment was all present and accounted for, which several people later noted as significant. These were not men who had fled. They had descended quickly and with purpose, the specific velocity of people who had made a professional assessment and reached a conclusion they wanted to act on immediately, but they had brought everything with them, and they had not run. The distinction seemed important to them. They mentioned it more than once. They did not say much that first evening. They ate at the inn with the focused quietness of men processing something, and they turned in early. And Dusk Hollow's informal intelligence network, which had been operating at heightened capacity since the Thornwood Company's arrival, was able to extract very little of substance before they retired. The ale loosened things somewhat the following evening. Not dramatically. These were not men inclined to drama, which made what emerged from the conversation more credible, in the estimation of the Dusk Hollow residents listening carefully from adjacent tables, than a more theatrical account would have been. They spoke in the MEI. Osler was gone before the evening meal. One moment his wagons were in front of the inn, his surveyors were filing reports in the common room, and the carefully organized machinery of the Thornwood Company's acquisition was proceeding through its established sequence of steps. The next, or so it seemed to Dusk Hollow, which had not been present for the private meeting between Osler and his surveyors and was reconstructing the timeline from fragments, the wagons were loaded and moving, and Osler's expensive boots were carrying him south at a pace that suggested he had somewhere significantly more important to be. He left no explanation. He canceled no contracts formally, filed no withdrawal documents, offered no statement to the village council that had spent 3 days in collective dread of his continued presence. That he simply ceased to be in Dusk Hollow, with the thoroughness of a man who had performed a rapid and decisive cost-benefit calculation and found the cost column so comprehensively dominant that extended deliberation would have been an insult to basic arithmetic. The village understood, without anyone formally declaring it, that the Thornwood Company was not coming back. The understanding moved through Dusk Hollow the way important understandings moved through small settlements, not through announcement, but through the gradual collective shift of atmosphere, the way a room changed when a threat left it, the almost physical sensation of a pressure releasing. People stood a little differently at the market on Wednesday. The conversations that had been conducted in the tight, worried shorthand of people sharing a problem opened back out into their ordinary registers. Old Peric was seen smiling at the mill for the first time in a week, which was noted and remarked upon. No one asked too many questions about why. This was, Mara thought when she heard about it, perhaps the most sensible thing Dusk Hollow had done throughout the entire affair. The quests. She packed her sack on Friday morning, same as always. The same waxed cloth around the salted pork. The same careful arrangement of iron moss pouches fitted around the food to keep everything stable on the climb. The same extra portion tucked beneath everything else at the bottom of the sack, wrapped separately, for Shadow. 3 years of Friday mornings had worn this ritual into her hands so completely that she could have performed it in darkness, and sometimes in the deep winter she nearly had. She climbed the path in the early light with the mountain quiet around her and the valley below still soft with morning mist. And she did not think about Osler or the Thornwood Company or the surveyors descending quickly with their equipment and their revised understanding of the world. Next, she thought about iron moss and the quality of the autumn light and whether the flat rock would be warm enough to sit on comfortably, which were the things she usually thought about on Friday mornings and which were sufficient. The 7 were waiting at the flat rock, same as always. She set everything out in the familiar order and stepped back and watched them eat with the particular contentment of someone whose weekly ritual had survived a disruption and emerged unchanged on the other side, which was its own quiet form of reassurance. Notch ate first with her usual serious efficiency. Spit and Ember conducted their eternal negotiation over the bread portions with a passion that 3 years had not diminished by any measurable degree. The others took their turns in their established order. Shadow ate last, same as always. Now when he had finished, he did not return to his usual position at the edge of the group. He walked to where Mara sat on her flat stone and settled beside her with the unhurried deliberateness of someone choosing a seat they intended to occupy for a while, and the warmth of him against her side was solid and real and familiar in the way that things became fam.